Chapter 3. Fitz was right. Levi couldn't sit here and stare at the walls of this cold, empty estate all day, waiting for his life to pass him by. Which was why Levi went out riding 3 times a day. Surging through the fields around the estate was the only time he felt like his old self. It was a heavily wooded area, and he enjoyed meandering through narrow paths while also giving his horse free rein to gallop over stretches of open areas. Sometimes he allowed his horse to choose their direction. It was not as though Levi had anywhere to go, anywhere to be, or anyone waiting for him, so what did it matter? Tonight, the ironically named Lucky had decided on the road more traveled, the one that led away from the estate. Perhaps Lucky had been listening to Fitz and was trying to return Levi to London. Sorry, Lucky, he muttered. I said no to Fitz, and I will say no to you too. Suddenly, Lucky increased his pace as though he had sensed temptation before him, and Levi peered out into the darkening sky. We should be heading back, he said, trying to turn the horse's head, but Lucky continued to pull forward, which was when Levi heard it too, a shout ahead of him. Instead of allowing the horse to run ahead, he slowed him down, leading him off the road, close to the line of trees so they'd be hidden from anyone who might lie in wait. Levi knew that he should turn around to leave this trouble to itself and return home, but old habits were sometimes difficult to break. He had spent enough time with the rifle in his hand that the pistol was already out and trained ahead of him. Using his legs to push Lucky slowly forward, the 4 figures on horseback soon came into view. The 3 men with their distinctive tricorn hats were fairly easy to identify, likely highwaymen who had stopped on a side road on their way to London to trade in their goods. Levi couldn't quite make out the person in the midst of them, however. When he heard a female voice, his stomach sank as he knew they had likely come upon a woman, one who would be far too tempting for such men to dismiss. The fact that she was alone was troubling. Had they done away with whoever had been accompanying her? We ask nicely, but you actually don't have a choice, he heard one of the men say. We could use some company tonight. Levi had no wish to become involved in this woman's problems, none at all, nor did he have any desire to take on highwaymen, especially ones who were willing to use violence to get their way. But he had not become so much of a beast that he would allow who was most likely an innocent woman to be taken by these men. He sighed as he brought the pistol up, pulled the cock fully back, trained the first man in his sights, and then pulled the trigger. What in the bloody hell was that? Linus? One of the remaining men shouted as the other began to back his horse away, looking from side to side. They had both pulled their pistols, but neither seemed to know where the shot had come from. Siena took some perverse satisfaction that they were the ones now panicking. Siena knew that she should run, but at the moment she was frozen in indecision. Was she safer to stay where she was or to turn around and try to escape? It was becoming difficult to know just which decisions were causing her more danger. When another gunshot sounded and the second thief clutched his knee as bright red blood spurted from it, she had to breathe deeply to keep from being further affected and trust the shooter could aim around her. The third man turned his horse around and bolted away, trying to outrun her surprising savior. Siena herself looked around in shock, but no one was coming forward to try to claim her in turn. Who is there? She called out, trying to instill bravery into her voice. Are you still here? She waited, holding her breath as her heart hammered against her ribs, and it was another minute before she finally caught sight of the figure on horseback, slowly walking toward her from the trees ahead. Thank you, she said as he neared. You saved me. He reached up, touching the brim of his hat, keeping his head tilted so that the wide brim concealed his face beneath. Had yourself in quite the predicament. I did, she said, a hiccupy sob escaping along with her words, and she slapped a hand over her mouth to keep it in. I thought, you thought right, he said grimly. Good thing you had Lucky. I am not sure I understand. My horse, he said, gesturing forward, name is Lucky. Oh, I see, she said, still not completely understanding. Well, thank you, Lucky, and thank you. I'm sorry, what is your name? Not necessary, he said with a slight shake of his head. Where are you going? It is a very long story, she said with a quivering breath. I am lost. Do you know how far Crawley is? A day or so, he said. Would not take long to return to London, though. No, she said quickly. I cannot go back there. She waited for him to ask why, but he just sat there, still and silent, obviously not caring about her reasons. What happened to your companion? My companion? I assume you are not out here alone. I am, actually, she said, lifting her head, not appreciating that a stranger would feel the need to pass judgment on her actions, as right as he might be. It was stupid to be out here alone, he said, and her mouth fell open in shock. Did you just call me stupid? I said stupid to be here alone, he said, his voice low and gravelly still. What did you think was going to happen? Well, I hadn't planned for this, she said, and he snorted, looking away from her. As he did, she caught a glimpse of the right side of his face, noting the beard that covered it and a handsome, princely profile. Why are you alone? He finally asked, sighing as though he hadn't wanted to know the answer, but realized its importance. I ran away from my wedding, she said, and his head lifted as though he was going to look at her. But before the brim of his hat rose completely, he lowered it once more. She had to admit that she had liked what she had been able to see, from the prominent cheekbone down the strong jawline to plush lips on the one side of his face. My parents were forcing me to marry a man who was over twice my age, you see, she said, which was not so much the issue, but the fact that he was rather the lecherous type. There were stories and, well, my friend convinced me to escape, and now I think I would have been best to stay and take my chances. It would have been better than highwaymen. She took a breath, realizing that she had likely said far too much. Thank you for saving me, she said, more quietly now. Where's the closest place I could find shelter for the night? He didn't say anything, just sat there, and a chill began to creep down Siena's spine. Somehow she had this innate feeling that she could trust this man, but he was so quiet. Perhaps she had only gotten rid of the highwaymen. Perhaps he had only gotten rid of the highwaymen to have her for himself. Thank you again, sir, she said. I shall go now. I did not mean to cause you trouble. She turned her horse to walk away, but she hadn't traveled more than a step or two when his voice called out, Stop. She paused, her horse following his command. You can come with me. Thank you, but I shall continue on, she said. I would not mean to cause you any more trouble than I already have. I have an estate nearby. When we arrive, my housekeeper will see to your needs. Your housekeeper, she repeated, intrigued that he would have an estate. He must be someone with means, although his intentions might not be any better than those of the highwaymen. But he had saved her. Who are you, and where are we? Near enough to Chiswick, he said. Who I am does not matter. He turned his horse, Lucky he had called him, back toward the way he had come, leaving her with the choice to follow or remain behind. She looked behind her into the night and then at the retreating back of the insufferably rude man in front of her. He had called her stupid, and yet he had saved her life. What was she to do? She closed her eyes and let her heart's intuition speak for her, and took a chance. Levi shouldn't care whether the girl followed him or not. She was just a slip of a thing, clearly frightened by him, and she hadn't even fully seen him. The last thing he wanted was to take her back to his estate, but he couldn't very well leave her in the middle of the road with night falling. He was worried about her and had a strange sense that it was up to him to protect her. Her story was far-fetched, and yet the gown peeking out from beneath her cloak was quite fine. Pieces of fair hair were falling over her shoulders, but aside from her dishevelment, her delicate features and thin, fine jewelry were those of a well-bred woman. He would give her a place to stay for the night, and then return her to London and this despicable fiancé tomorrow. It was all he could do. I know you think me a fool, she said softly behind him, apparently having decided that he was a less threatening option compared to the dark woods. It seemed the best decision at the time, and I had a plan. It just went awry. He said nothing, allowing her to keep talking. Her voice was sweet and melodic, flowing over him in waves, somehow soothing his tortured spirit. Where did you learn to shoot like that? She asked. The military. You were in the military? I was, he said with some hesitation, unsure if she would think that was a positive or negative. Not that it mattered. You are not any more then? Were you injured? You are inquisitive. He supposed after the day she'd had, she'd deserve to know more about the man she was following. But all she needed to know was that he was best avoided. Siena studied the back of the man in front of her. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a build that tapered closer to his hips, although it was difficult to tell with his cloak billowing behind him. As darkness had fallen, he had lifted his head, no longer hiding his face beneath the brim of his wide, unfashionable hat. Siena couldn't help but be intrigued by the shadowy figure, as much as she should likely be fearful. His silence, compared to most people in her life, was something of a refreshing change, even if his grunts were frustrating. She had more questions, but after the surge of unwelcome excitement, fatigue was setting in through her entire body, and she had to fight to keep her eyes open. They must have closed for a moment, for suddenly her whole body was jolting upright, her heart pounding once more as she realized she had nearly fallen off of her horse. Her companion never looked back, never turned around to see if she was still following him, let alone still attached to the horse. He probably didn't care and was only now doing what was expected of him. Siena was about to ask how much farther they had to go when a building rose up in front of them, seemingly from nowhere. She first noticed the portico, supported by columns with triangular pediments crowning on top. Beneath was a grand entrance, to the sides symmetrical wings fanning out with identical large rectangular windows, with an odd look of eyes peering out into the night. It might just be the light, she considered, wondering if the gray hue of the building was also from the darkness, or if it was truly as dreary as it appeared. Second-floor balconies adorned with wrought iron railings stuck out of the sides like leering grins, and Siena shivered at the sight of the cold, austere building. She looked around, expecting to be led up an ornate drive trimmed in hedgerows, similar to the estates she more commonly frequented. But instead, the landscape around them was nearly barren, borders of garden blocks, the only memories of previous opulence. Do you live here? Her voice came out as more of a squeak. I do, he said, swinging down from his horse with ease before taking the reins of hers, lifting a hand to help her down. Her legs were numb from being so long on the horse, and when she swayed right into him, he caught her, an arm coming hard and strong around her. Steady, he murmured in her ear, as though he were speaking to a horse. Siena barely noticed the groom appear and take their horses, likely round to a stable, as her exhaustion threatened to overwhelm all. The man led Siena up the front stairs beneath the massive portico, not offering his arm, but staying a step behind her as she held onto the railing. The moment they stepped through the front doors, he called out, "Mrs. Porter?" As Siena surveyed the entrance, the dome on top of them covered in stained glass that she could imagine cast beautiful colors around the entryway in the daylight. Soon enough, a plump woman clad in black with a surprised expression that quickly fell into a welcoming smile appeared in the front entrance. "Who do we have here?" she said, looking from Siena to the mysterious man, who appeared to be the master of the house, and back again. "I found this young woman being accosted by highwaymen," he said, his voice back to its curt gruffness. "She has had a trying day and needs a place to stay, just for the night. Help her, Mrs. Porter?" "Of course," Mrs. Porter said, coming to Siena and taking her hands in hers. Siena felt reassured and safe with the woman, and suddenly she wanted nothing more than to curl up and sleep, protected by this strange house and people she had never met before, yet seemed more trustworthy than those in her own family. She turned around to thank the man, but her attempt was in vain. He was gone.